So put stop. I've also put timestamps in the chat. If I forget to, apologies, but I'll do my best. Uh, if you have any preferences over POIs other than POIs in the chat, please indicate such at the beginning of your speech. With that, I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister to open the debate. Best of luck, everyone.
Hi, am I audible?
You are.
Thank you. All right, starting this speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 parts of this speech. Firstly, setting up the debate and characterizing what this technology looks like. Secondly, explaining why this provides people with a set of incredibly useful information that will be used in a productive series of ways generally in society. And then thirdly, specifically on how this is really good for interpersonal mediation of conflicts. So, setup. There are 2 things that I want to address in setup. The first is why this technology would likely be widely accessible to a wide variety of people. The first thing to say here is just that the existence of this technology is likely to be known, and since it is quite revolutionary, something that most people would want and find valuable in their day-to-day lives, which I'll obviously illustrate further in the speech, it is probably true that there would be great political uproar if this was in any way meaningfully kept from people. This would certainly be a topic of election, like if one party wanted to give it to people and one party didn't. The second thing I'd like to point out is just that to the extent that this technology is created, manufactured, and produced by companies, there's likely to be competition once this is created to get that product to market, to make it accessible, and to allow people to access it. Because, as I've explained, there's likely to be such a huge consumer basis for this. I'll take the clarification.
Quantum computers exist. That doesn't mean anyone can have one. You don't have this fiat.
Okay, so I don't necessarily understand why the technology is as difficult as quantum computers, but that analysis still explains why, in the long run, when people started developing this, it would be made accessible. And that analysis explains why companies would put a huge amount of research and development into making it accessible. See the drastic improvements in quantum computing over the last 10 years. So the second thing that I'll explain is just what would this measure and clarify a few things, pretty much what's stated in the topic. So you'd be able to perceive 2 things from this. You would be able to see, like, the effect that it would have on people essentially, and like how they would react. So you probably wouldn't know why people are reacting in a specific way, but you'd be able to figure out like how they're going to react, how have they reacted now that they've got this information? Are they happy? Are they sad? So let's then move on to the 2 substantive claims from opening government. The first is to explain that this is incredibly useful information that will be for a variety of reasons. The first is that it just means that you are far more able to reach things like political consensus, agreement, or unity and have productive discourse. And that's for the reason that often people, when they make a claim, don't actually understand how deep of an effect it might have had someone and why and how so strongly it is incurring backlash. And what that allows you to do when you make a claim or you upset someone or a broad variety of people is firstly actually identify the demographic of people that have been made incredibly upset by this, which provides you an immediate amount of huge information you can use to, first of all, if you want to rectify that, if politicians want to address those concerns, for example, or government policymakers want to be more specific in capturing the attention and needs of those individuals. But secondly, it also does things like de-escalates huge amount of conflict or like polarization in political systems, because it means that you can do that as soon as possible before things like ingrained trauma or absolute disdain are ingrained because you keep repeating this mistake over and over again in the status quo, or at least to a much greater comparative extent than in our side. The second thing to explain is that this just means that a variety of important political policies can be far more easily assessed and analyzed. This is things, and even if they seem trivial, like questions like, are violent video games actually bad for people? How much culpability do people actually have over things like hate speech? Early offers in education programs about whether or not this is likely to make people lazy or actually a lot more de-stressed, for example. And there are mechanisms in the status quo, things like polling, which is, I think, in many instances, the best we have to assess people. But the problem with a lot of this is problems with polling and assessing people in general. They don't always report accurately. You can't always get polls to the people who need them to assess that information. Many people, when they do report, as I said, don't report accurately. And that just means that you clarify discourse in a way that is more precise, in a way that is more productive, and you get rid of all the confusion and, I guess, white noise in conversations, which actually delays the productive parts of discourse, which is meaningful changes to the way that people make decisions and engage with other people. The third thing I'm going to do is just preempt an argument about this being used as propaganda. I think there are four things to say here. The first is that if you can actually measure and tangibly demonstrate how bad propaganda is concretely in a way that is data-driven, you can probably create a much stronger case for regulating against things like that, which is very difficult to do in the status quo, because not only is it ambiguous, as I've explained, but people often hesitant for the reasons that it relates to things like freedom of speech, which in many democratic countries is seen as like an inalienable right or something, and takes a lot of convincing for people often to overcome that initial reaction to things like, oh, you're taking away my speech. The second thing to say here is just that to the extent that people are more aware of things like propaganda or their ability to be assessed, they are likely more critical of a lot of the information that exists. The third thing to say is just that one way you can do propaganda is to lie to people and be deceptive. But another way you can just do propaganda is just like being correct, like actually figuring out what evidence that is true. You need to convince someone of a claim, which actually suggests that in the long term, correct arguments in discourse are likely to win out because people don't spend a huge amount of time searching or trying different strategies. They immediately know what they need to say to resolve an issue. But the fourth and final thing to say here is that the margin of this argument would be quite small for the reason that it's already done pretty perversely and badly in the status quo. Is there a POI from closing? No.
Yeah,
How
sure.
do you
This
think that this
only
works? Sorry,
Closing.
how do you think this actually works out in more developing countries where there's going to be significantly more asymmetry of power between actors?
I don't know, but I think I've already mitigated that with literally what I just said. I'm sure Ellie will rebut it. The final thing I want to touch on this speech is just things like mediation and how this applies on a more individual level in people's lives. The thing that I would say here is that it's actually really difficult in a lot of interpersonal relationships to identify things like, why are people angry at you? I don't understand how they've reacted to the thing that I've said, for example. And in many instances, that just provides you with like the ability to just apologize, better explain yourself, or even address the concerns that people have. And we would say in things like relationships, when you prematurely say something like, I love you to someone, or and they don't react well, it's often very easy to have that conversation with them now and address and recognize the fact that they're upset. And we think the consequence of that is just that, rather than people not talk about issues and, do things like become less friendly with each other or not engage with each other as productive, or even if they do make up in the future, just have a period of their life where they don't have as much access to those types of support structures and the people that they really care about. You immediately remove a lot of those harms and you empower people to feel like they have agency over the people around them and that they can actually be helpful in many instances. At the end of this speech, I'm going to do a couple quick points of weighing. I think that we've demonstrated immediately why the largest change in this debate actually just occurs by expanding people's autonomy, and their ability to make informed and correct decisions. That speeds up all the current benefits and avenues in society where people are addressing and having questions over meaningful issues. It allows you to maximize people's utility and aggregate important information for decisions. Vote opening government.
I would like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and I welcome the leader of opposition. Here, here.
Cool. POIs in chat, please. I'll aim to take CG. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 points in my speech. 1, why the people who will get access to this are those who are most powerful right now. 2, why corporations have immense power to coerce people to buy things that they don't need. Then I'm going to explain why states have immense power to control their own citizens and to influence citizens in other countries. 1 brief point of setup. I want to apologize to Amitai. I did smoke about half a gram because we thought we dropped. So my weed is actually Amitai's 13th reason why. It's actually Ishai's fault. He thought we dropped. So Ishai is Amitai's 13th reason why. It could be that this preamble is Amitai's 13th reason why. Let's get into the first argument. Let's give a bunch of reasons for us want to be bad actors doing this. First, good actors have moral guidelines that limit them from lies and mistruths. Activists, politicians, etc., mostly just try to depict to people reality. They don't try to necessarily influence and change their minds into lies about reality. Unlike people like Trump or China or Big Pharma, who have countless interests to lie to the public in order to benefit off of their misunderstandings. But let's be more specific. It's bad authoritarian governments which have concentrated money and power. First, they are are centralized. That means they can mobilize the most money, utilize this to the greatest extreme. Think Saudi Arabia, Singapore, China. But secondly, they're authoritarian. That means they can easily limit others within their countries from using influence meters. But secondly, it's corporations that have the most wealth and have purely greed-based incentives. They have tons to gain from this. It allows them to measure the effectiveness of their advertising, which Pfizer already spends $10 billion a year on. It allows them to fight PR battles, to influence politics when it's necessary. And it often is for companies like Amazon or Nestle. It allows them to mobilize, and they're easily able to mobilize the required funds. They already spend billions of dollars on this stuff. They already have massive mega AI servers, quantum computers, and equivalent things that are as hard to get. Why do I think it's going to be hard to get? OG purely assume that it's going to be cheap and accessible. The motion lets them assume it's magical, it's accurate, it's completely measures the effect on specific nuanced groups like debaters in their early 20s, but they don't get to fundamentally alter the laws of physics and say that I'm able to do all that from my smartphone. First, it needs access to tons of data about tons of people. It needs probably billions of data points, even for a small group. Secondly, it needs tons of processing power. If there's billions of bits and complex equations that try to compare all of this, you can't do it on a simple computer. Three, it requires tons of control. You need to follow along people's lives, measure them with street cameras and their online behaviors, and observe and analyze the various ways that they change their behavior in order to understand how they were affected by a specific influence. Note, if we want to make this less magical and more based on science, there's a minimum size that transistors can get, and we're approaching it. A supercomputer cannot become much smaller than it is. At that point, if normal tech can't do it, then I think we need probably quantum computers that can far more accurately predict nuanced behavior of people due to entanglement and fun stuff. At the very least, we need really fancy AI. We likely need both of these things. Maybe we need something brand new like dark matter, which is even more expensive. OG have no reason to tell you that this super fancy technology is going to be cheap and accessible. So now that I've shown you that it's going to be held by bad actors and that bad actors make more and worse use of it, let's talk about how corporations have immense power to coerce people to buy things they don't need. This is similar to the banning ads motion, except now the advertisers are literally mind readers. So we would like to please ban the mind reading ads, please. How does this allow corporations to tailor make ads? Note, they already use tons of data, psychologists, experts, to try and predict exactly what's going to persuade you. But this motion is a unique tipping point. It lets you actually measure. You know those annoying polls on YouTube where they ask you, hey, which ads have you seen recently? They are so unaware of what actually persuades you and what doesn't that they fight for every little bit of information they can get about this. This motion gives them full access to the information of how persuaded you are by this. So how do people get forced to buy things that they don't want and don't actually need? First, they get targeted per very small groups. This is especially true if you're a corporation that can afford the processing power to target very small groups. It's like the TikTok algorithm. It can be debaters in their 20s who like history. Okay, that's a pretty large group. But it can be very specific groups and very targeted groups. And it can be repeat ads. So I measure that I affected you to some extent. Oh, let's just show you this ad 10 times. And then, note, I can adjust what group you're in. If you are now in the group of people who are on the fence about my product, I can change my ads to be tailor-made to you. So I always know precisely how you feel about my product and what and how persuaded you are to buy it, and can select specific groups of people who are as persuaded as you and target advertisements exactly to them. How does this harm people? First, it just wastes people's money. It makes lots of people buy things that they wouldn't otherwise buy. We think that when people need something, they know they need it. Amazon is accessible enough. Their nearby supermarket is accessible enough. We think that many people don't have the money to waste on these things. They end up doing impulse buys, especially around holidays, especially when they're watching ads, especially when these ads tell them like, oh, it's on sale and you should buy it now. And they try to make them do it quickly because they know that it's not a rational choice, but it's something people only do spontaneously. But not only do we waste their money, which would be better used to pay their rent or their loans or whatever, we turn them into consumerists. We tie joy and happiness for them to the purchasing experience, and it's never enough because as soon as they bought one thing, we developed a new model the next year, and now we're advertising that new model to them the next year. And they always feel positive validation when they purchase something. They feel positive validation when they open something, and then they're constantly inundated with more ads to buy more things, which make them accustomed to spending all their money on this happiness. And third, it actively sells them things that harm them. Imagine if the prescription opioids had the ability to precisely measure how persuaded people are to use them. Imagine if cigarette companies in countries where they're legal. Imagine if Nestle got to pass on their formula to exactly the people they wanted. And there's also a principle here of brain autonomy. Amitai is going to talk to you about how states control their own citizens. Let's take before that a POI from closing.
So the factors that influence you change. If everyone's buying cigarettes, which they are destroying their lungs with, then they can realize their lungs are being destroyed and then stop believing the message because they're dying.
That's too late. late. If you've already were persuaded by Apple to buy another iPhone you didn't need, then you're already not paying back your student loans. If you already got the cigarettes or the opioids, you're addicted. And now you know opioids are bad for you, but it's far too late for you. You need to contend why Big Pharma won't use this to make billions of people around the world addicted to opioids in countries that, unlike the United States, don't have the same degree of regulation and protection. Because I think they will. And I have no clue how any good actor who has this same tool is going to have the ability to counteract that. But let's talk about the principal value of brain autonomy. Other people shouldn't have access to what I know without my consent. It's not just a practical harm when they get to coerce me, it's a principal harm. My autonomy and my ability to control my life is dependent on the fact that some things are private, some things no one can influence, because as soon as people know it, they can influence it. As soon as they know my intimate details, I have no way to avoid them persuading me to support and believe things that I don't want to believe. This is a principal harm because we believe that no one should have this power, and we oppose this power existing, but we believe especially big bad actors with big bad interests shouldn't have this power. For all of these reasons, proud to propose. I keep forgetting that.
I would like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and I welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Hi, just checking I'm clearly audible.
You are.
Sick, POIs in the chat, please don't interrupt me. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. 3 parts to this speech. Firstly, on access. Secondly, on misinformation. Thirdly, on information. Firstly, on access. A couple of things to say. First thing I want to note is, like, honestly, it's like 3:46 a.m. here. I don't have the brain power to get into the fiat clash. But this is a prefers a world debate. Like, we're talking about a different world. I don't need to mech out the physics here. I think we can assume that this exists. And so I think maybe OO should like do the debate. And also, I think if it is indeed so intensely physically like problematic as they say, I actually don't know that it's going to be as corporately widespread and like selling you shoes. That I think is a little bit unlikely. The second thing I want to note is I think they just cherry pick technologies that are inaccessible, but clearly things like polling are accessible in the status quo, and actually like lots of people like it's the results are often published, which I think doesn't necessarily settle this, but I think should make you skeptical that necessarily like access to information is something that always acts in the way they describe, in a way that is super inaccessible, in a way that no one can engage with. But the second thing I want to note is we explain and we provide a bunch of reasons to you why there is clearly a huge appeal for giving people accessibility to this information. We explain that this information feeds into social harmony in really important ways. And I think it's really unclear why governments wouldn't want like health charities to be able to communicate why vaping is bad effectively. I think that's unexplained at all. They're just like, assume we live in a dystopia. I honestly think we probably don't. But finally, I just want to note, like, if it is the case that states have bad incentives, I think in the status quo, states factually collect a lot of information on people to try to persuade them of things. They do very little comparative work to explain why that is preferable. And I think imprecisely collecting information on people is quite bad, partly because it is extremely invasive. Like, it is bad when the government is surveilling you with CCTV cameras. I don't know why this is principally a worse imposition. Particularly, I think that it is perhaps less interventionist in people's lives. But additionally, because states still surveilling you, still trying to compel you to do particular things, but doing so more coercively using like violent force or less precisely and getting worse results, I think is still pretty bad. They need to be more comparative. But finally, I just want to note that I think it is quite unclear why merely having retrospective access to how persuasive a message was allows you to like press the magic like start liking smoking button. Like, this doesn't tell you the way to make everyone want to smoke. It just lets you assess how effective your pro-smoking messaging was. They do not explain why people's preferences cannot change over time, why they cannot be counteracted by other people in society. They use magical thinking in this debate and should not credit it. I'm going to move on to misinformation and respond to, I think, what I suspect will be an opposition bench harm, which is that people are able to target misinformation in a way that people believe it more on our side of the debate. I think there are a couple of problems with this argument that mean it cannot be debate winning. Firstly, I think you should weigh it against the benefit of having targeted correct information. And I think that is particularly important because oftentimes, sorry, the other thing I would say is I think you should weigh it against the harm of people being misinformed, not because because of intentional misinformation, but just because they misunderstand things or messaging is insufficiently imprecise. I think that's particularly true in like low information and low education environments where people are not always being perverse. They're not always trying to, actively troll people or actively confuse people, but merely their messages are inefficient, and that results still in all the harms of misinformation. So if we on net make information more precise, if we make it easier for people to understand in general, I think that often that is outweighed by people understanding good messages better as well. The second thing I want to note though is I think that you can use this tool diagnostically to see where misinformation has huge amounts of harm. I think it is likely that you can, for instance, be quite critical of misinformation where you can point to its culpability in people taking bad actions. For instance, people buying into like anti-vax messaging and things like that. But I think thirdly, I guess you should just be skeptical of this claim on principle. Like, it is true that a risk of understanding people better or being able to persuade people of things is that you could use that perversely. But I don't think that's a very good reason why we should not, in general, try to understand others better or try to be able to persuade people better. I think, like, yes, there's a risk, but I think that the principled value of better communication is something that probably outweighs that. But finally, I just want to note that I think that their harms are just like a bit mysterious in this debate, in that they're like, well, the harm here is that this makes you want to buy things that you really like. I don't really know why it's a problem if advertising is like pretty good at picking out the shoes that you like. Like, advertising on either side often makes people buy things. It's just like makes you buy things that you like a bit less on their side of the house. You clearly still have like a culture of commercialism. Like, we exist in the context all around us. We fall out of a coconut tree. Like, clearly, like I just think that is pretty inexclusive, and I don't think they do a good job of explaining why greater precision is a big harm. So I think misinformation on principle should be weighed out of the debate, and it is likely outweighed by the benefits to information I'm about to deliver. And I think they do not do a good job distinguishing why it is likely to be a particular harm. I'll take a point from closing now.
Yeah, I don't know why you spread correct information with this technology, because you don't prove that's what's convincing to people. Rather, you find more deceptive ways to convince people. You have to prove why convincing correct information is more convincing, given people's biases and bubbles.
No, I don't. What? Like, there's a set of people who want to communicate correct information. Like, I'm the Department of Health and I want to communicate that you should be vaccinated. And I have access to this, which lets me see how persuasive different pro-vaccination messages are and pick the most persuasive one. So that suggests that, like, come on. All right, I'm going to do some more explanation of this information thing, because I'll just explain it. All right. Let's talk about why information is better on our side of the house. I think the key mech we give you here is just that unpredictability of information has a bunch of harms. That is to say, it's a huge source of frustration, disconnection, and alienation. You communicate and have your communicative needs unmet, which creates a sense of fragmentation from the people with whom you're trying to communicate. And repeated communicative failures create path dependency, where you no longer trust people to listen or to be accessible. Where governments, for instance, tell people to get vaccinated in ways that seem confusing and inconsistent because they're trying a bunch of shit, but they're not really measuring its effectiveness successfully. That is something which leads to decreased effectiveness of that messaging over time. And I think informational harms are also bad because they deprive people of something valuable agency-wise. We should generally err, I think, towards maximizing the mutual compatibility of people participating in communication. And I think the reason why true messages are often believable is, of course, just that they often accord with people's lived reality. But additionally, it is unclear why, like, if you are making a persuasive claim, if you're trying to tell someone to do something, that is automatically magically more persuasive when it is untrue as opposed to when it is true. But finally, I would just contest the incentive structures provided by opposition bench. I do not think it is the case that governments get a kick out of misleading people for fun. Governments on net have relatively large incentives to do things like promote social harmony and cohesion or promote, good health practices. I think it is far more likely that these kind of technologies are used to persuade people not to smoke than to smoke, given that that is clearly in the set of incentives that the vast majority of governments in the world already have, but simply fail to do because they do not have the capacity to communicate those messages persuasively. We give it to them. So proud to govern.
I would like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and I welcome the Leader of Opposition, or Deputy Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear.
Sorry, 1 second. Let me just put my headphones on. Okay. Well, it's not connected. Sorry, 1 second. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, that's good now.
Love it. Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So it might seem that at the end of top half, if you choose to credit each one-liner assertion of an impact that OG have, that we're a bit of a deadlock, where we have a deep impact, they have a few assertion-y impacts. I will do a few things in this speech to break that sense of deadlock. The first thing I want to do is explain why OG's disregard of our explanation about lack of access to these things by a wide array of people breaks the deadlock against any possible government impact. Why is this a very important question that IL tackles? One, it answers the question about whether we have more benevolent or malevolent actors that are able to use this messaging, that are able to use this barometer. Notice that if we have more corporations that convince me that I should invest less in welfare policies, and some government messaging about the fact that we should use welfare policies, insofar as I'm more exposed to something that will be catered in order to convince me the most, I get already so entrapped within the narrative that I am exposed to more that it's going to be very hard for me to be convinced by an alternate narrative later, because I already associate a cognitive dissonance with not wanting to change my opinion after I've already taken actions, after I've already voted based on this. I don't want to think that the thing I did was bad. So if we prove that there are more of these malevolent actors, our impacts are automatically weighed over. Secondly, this engages with their claim about interpersonal relationships, because if the average person doesn't have access to this, they cannot utilize this. But thirdly, I also just, yeah, okay, that's it. So why did we tell you it was far less widely accessible? That didn't really get a response from DPM, right? We told you not only that it is incredibly hard to develop, which means that only the most rich of corporations will be able to hone into this, but also that it's likely that they have the incentive to do this because of the patent protection, like through patent protection, in order to outcompete other companies that could maybe also use this for advertising. The claim for PM to this is, but it's unlikely because there's demand for this to be democratized because it affects people. Ayal points out in a POI that many things affect people's lives very dearly, and yet they're held exclusively in the hands of corporations. Insulin patents in the United States, literal fucking food that's held in the hand of Monsanto and not given to farmers that die in the street in developing countries. Why is this any different? If anything, I think that there's a narrative norm that says that insofar as you own something, you can get to develop it in whatever ways you want because of the capitalist structures of incentives that make it so we need to make companies be able to hoard these products, which I think means that these companies, given the incentive and the capacity by the public approval, will hoard these things and will use them much more than any of the benevolent entities they talk about. Second way to break the deadlock in top half, I think that it's likely we get the good information they talk about more on our side of the house. There are two reasons for this. The first is that messages that relate to truth and virtues are more convincing when you don't know how to convince people in the most populist of ways. And the reason for this is because if there is not a thing that would appeal to me naturally the most, if you don't talk about my trauma as a collective society and then relate it to a specific body, if you don't talk about the sort of messaging and jargon that I am most likely to be receptive to, then there's much less irrational biases to believe one narrative over the other. This is important because it means that suddenly the deadlock barriers when you're unable to as irrationally influence people become twofold. One, what is perceived as more virtuous? What do we feel is more right to do? Which is why today, because corporations cannot over-influence us towards things like consuming too much cigarettes, even if some people consume cigarettes, or completely eliminating welfare provisions and things of that sort, because of our intuition that something is right to do, we often default to the good thing. But secondly, because even if that's not true, there are metrics of truth that we can look for. The fact that we do know that some people on the street will be too poor, and if we know this as a fact and there's not a strong enough narrative to dissuade us from this truth, then we're likely to default to this thing that is correct. They say the truth gets strengthened on their side of the house because you'll just check against the narrative that is bad if it is more convincing. But the problem with this is the truth tends to be rather moderate. It's not always true that cigarettes will kill you the day after. So if you're able to craft a strong enough and sensational enough narrative, truth won't matter at that point in order to make people believe you. It only matters if the narrative that you craft isn't strong enough to make you irrationally tainted. So I actually think we get the good things they talk about more on our side of the house for this independent reason. Thirdly, let's talk about impacts if you want to break the deadlock based on this. Ayal told you that money is a thing that we lose. They say, why is it bad? You just spend more time on products. The problem, and then they say this doesn't change, right? Because corporations anyway influence us. Obviously, this is a scalarized impact. The question is, if I waste a lot of my money and then have still some money for rent and some money for food in order to feed my family, too much of the money in the race for material glamour and things of that sort. We tell you that we shift that balance, which currently exists around the basic things that I do need, around getting enough money to fund my family, around voting on government policies that will keep corporations in check. We push it that extra mile over this critical endpoint, which means that I do start consuming things that otherwise I would stop consuming that would make me die much sooner, which means that I do lose out on the money that I most need in order to feed my family. But secondly, the principal avenue of this impact is also important, because if you want to adjudicate this round on impacts, if they have a practical and we have a practical, the addition of a principal impact should probably sway it at this point. And what is the principal impact? We think it's very simple. We already in the status quo think that even if you don't tell lies, if you create a narrative that's strong enough to make someone act in an irrational way, that is wrong. This is why we have mitigating circumstances against people that act in religious radicalism. This is why when Stockholm Syndrome applies, we wouldn't think that this is something that people did of their own volition. Yes, second half.
If you buy 10 packs of Nestle cereal rather than 5, is it more important than a rebel village getting wiped out by an evil government that wants to kill them?
What a straw man. It's exactly the point at which you stop criticizing your government and the corporations that are bankrolling all sorts of things that cause these conflicts to begin with, because of the fact that you have much more ESL moment, whatever, bad conditions in developing countries. Okay, so in terms of that in terms of the principal impact of bad misinformation, we think that this is the point at which you know that the worst kinds of irrational narratives can be pushed into each specific group because you tailor it to that specific group's irrational extremist point of view as you when you advertise as a corporation. Lastly, in terms of conflict, I actually think conflict gets worse on their side, because the way we flip them is they say you want to pacify people. This is the presumption that PM makes. I think you don't want to pacify people, because those that will spread the information about the conflict are those that are most proximate to you, that live in your communities, right? They're the ones that you have most access to and that are closer to you, so you see them the most, but also the ones that you credit the most because you know they have lived in this area. These people will probably have the incentive to spread information that further radicalizes you because they have been bathed into anti-colonialist narratives, etc. For those reasons,
I would like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and I welcome the member of government. Here, here.
Am I clearly audible?
Yep, you are.
All right. Okay, got it. All right, I'll take opening opposition at least once. Please do unmute. All right. This is finals. I think I can say this. Thank you, Amelia. This was a very fun tournament. I like the fact that we debated fun stuff. All right. Okay. If most post-colonial governments were good at pushing nationalism onto the people that they ruled, most of them wouldn't become the war zones that they are today. We think that the point of influence is to understand what it is that changes people's decisions that we don't know already, which is where I think OG has a gap. OG gives you a lot of impacts. But the thing is that OO points out how AI already can do these things at a top level. This exacerbates it, and they both assume that the change is just more control. I think it's a bit questionable that this is the case. You need to understand what the exact extent is. We think that governments fail to pull their countries together because they cannot negotiate politically, not because of the mediating that OG talks about, but because it's in a crisis. The first gap on OG that I'm going to fill is explain to you why current research leads to bad outcomes that we don't understand, which means that their benefit is good and not just the power to control people. First of all, current research has a self-reporting bias. In other words, people can only tell you what they think influences them. And even if you measure the biological effects on that person, that requires a MRI machine, which is quite expensive. And even when you do measure those biological impulses, we don't understand brain chemistry very well because our brain is multifaceted. Sometimes things get aroused because of excitement. Sometimes things get aroused because of disagreement. What influence tells us is specifically if the message's effect on them was that. But second, because it's more accessible, it's just clearly cheaper. And the reason for this is because opening opposition is very confusing. They say it's highly expensive, like quantum computing. But unlike nuclear missiles, which is quite easily restricted in the real world, it's also profitable, so businesses can make money from it. OG says this will be sold as a result. The simple question is you don't actually have to sell it, you just have to sell the information, which means that it's easily accessible because people can conduct a lot more research with fewer pieces of equipment, and then they can spread out that information accurately and sell it to people. And also they can rent out the equipment needed for it because that's what makes them money. And also if they're having a lot of investment into it, to make the money back, they need to have people using it. Not everyone who develops this will be Amazon. It will also be AI firms that don't give a fuck if someone gets strong in the market because that's the best way to make money. And even if it is Amazon, an AI firm can develop it and then beat Amazon, which is why that this idea of free markets controlling all this information doesn't make sense. It's so profitable, other people can make it. Anyway, that means it's accessible, and a lot of this information that we wouldn't have had otherwise is coming to us. Third of all, there's a lot of hidden information, especially in political context. This looks like community leaders hiding what they genuinely believe in or what their policy suggestions are because they're strategically trying to negotiate. But it also looks like people who don't even know what they want. It looks like protesters not realizing that what they're protesting about isn't the main thing that changes their mind. You might be protesting about abortion rights, and that might be very important to you. But only through this kind of meter can you then tell they often care about things like feminism and women's rights and see that as the narrative that persuades them and not the narrative of, for example, someone's life. This is useful in places where you don't have this information, which is why a lot of top half is a bit weird because countries already have lots of research on what their political groups want. They prepare themselves and don't make faux passes in the way that OG talks about. They plan for it. And opening opposition is also confusing because they say no one will regulate the power these institutions have because they'll convince you of something. But they forget that there are competitors and regulators who can send other messages that might also convince you that that is not a good decision, which is why the incentive OO gives, which is that corporations are really likely to exploit people, don't compete with the governmental incentive of just wanting to protect people through voting and the individual incentive of people seeing the people around them having their lives ruined through getting cigarettes through bad advertisements and saying, fuck, that's bad. The third thing is Amrita tries to fix this by saying, oh, when you make the decision, you believe it because sunk cost. This is weird. Sunk cost is right now. You bought the product. But then on government, it was because of the fucking influencing meter. It knew exactly how to sell to you, which is why often when we get products because of an algorithm, we are more likely to doubt our choices because we say the algorithm is making me do this. A lot of people stay off social media for these reasons because there's counter narratives against this. All of this means the stuff in developed world is quite unimportant. What happens in the developing world? First of all, governments have extremely good incentives, but they fail repeatedly. The first reason they have good incentives is because economically, they have to make money efficiently in the long term. The reason for this is because if they don't have money, they can't maintain power with their military. They can't pay off the stakeholders and supporting them. But second, it needs to be consistent because these people want a legacy. Often when you're forming a new party, often you have a long-term chance of winning every election in the future because you are the revolutionary party. And this means that you want to make sure you have economic growth into the 10, 20 years because that's what your record is going to be. So the Congress ruled for 70 years. They knew that was going to be the record. The BJP is making long-term investments because they know they're going to win the next election. The third reason is you literally need it for everything. Like if you want to expand your influence internationally, you need more money. But second of all, they're politically very likely to want to stop conflict, but they fail, which is the crux of the CG case. Without this technology, governments fail to stop conflict and we prevent that from happening and we stop bad dictatorships from emerging. First, because concentration of power is something they want to prevent, right? They want to make sure that people don't have lots and lots of hatred towards the government because that is what causes risks of rebellion and so on. And second, they want narratives which are extremely hard to form because there's lots of different people in these areas and multi-ethnic, different religions and so on. So you need to keep trying, which has a chance of failure, which obviously means that you can often risk conflicts. OG says that governments don't do this. We explicitly frame where it matters the most and why it's such a big deal. Third of all, it's also because you don't want a threat to your life. The biggest fear for a dictator is someone coming into his house and he knows what they're going to do to him. I'm not going to say what happened to like Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein, but you guys know that. Fourth of all, it's because you want a trustworthy institution because corruption is bad for you. And this is what's really surprising to a lot of people. But even if you're a corrupt dictator, people corrupt are bad because you get less control over them. They steal more money for themselves. So you want more control over people and efficient institutions for trust and respect. These are reasons you have good incentives. Finally, impacting the really good decisions that governments make now because they pull people together and why this technology accesses that and then wane. Opening opposition.
So not only do whistleblowers and departments of health intuitively have less money than corporations, it's also just unclear why they were benevolent actors. Presumably, the way that I convince the most people, instead of being pro-vaccines, is just convincing and propagandizing them.
Yeah, so this is a great point, except that if you're a company that works on selling vaccines and you want to stop the competitor, you will ask the regulator to put more restrictive standards on them, which means that there's lobbying from both sides. Second of all, small businesses might not be larger, but they're really important electorally, so this flips that. Okay, the impacts first. People make bad decisions in terms of believing, like pushing narratives that are very bad in these areas. And now we know exactly what influences them. We can take the research and time to figure this out and convince them of the values we're pushing onto them. So instead of Iran falling into a complete chaotic landscape because you believe that religion was a pathway forward, you can find something that is moderate enough that appeals to everyone. I can't give you the narrative because presumably you have to figure it out. These are beliefs that are very core. We don't understand them yet. But second of all, it's also things that you might believe are sensational in opposition, but those aren't long term. And that's what we prove, which is that sensational narratives create frustration between groups because it also pisses someone off, which is what the great, amazing thing about this is. You only focus on your core base because that's who you understand. This tells you what the most persuasive and influential thing for everyone in the economy is, so you can push moderate solutions. This means you don't have to kill kids in order to get them to follow you. You don't have to do things like North Korea where people are scared of you. You can make them genuinely love you and not be scared they might run off to another country.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and I welcome the member of opposition. Hear, hear.
Hello. So I'm just going to talk a bit quickly to audio check because in this tournament that's been happening that sometimes I just cut up when I talk a bit quickly. I hope that was audible and no cutouts happened.
All good.
Oh, great. Yeet. Okay. Okay, I want to make it clear. I think that OG and CG are fair for pushing against OO that is most likely is going to be accessible to people. I think Google is very hard, but like I can access it because you can sell the service, as CG fairly points out. But also I didn't think that they actually explained why it is likely for you to actually have competition making it accessible for people. I think to that extent, we can just go into extent on a lot of things. Now, I want to note, right? All teams so far are basically saying, this is a powerful tool because you can basically test other tools. OO says you can able to actually explain why, ads can change people. But they never actually explain why any tool can be as powerful to reach the impacts that they want. Why are ads possible to even persuade someone to do something as bad as making unwise economic decisions? But I also want to note that they themselves, CG harms themselves by saying, but there are also alternative groups. So yes, you might have, for example, a government in developing nations who might have some good incentives, but there might be opposition parties who actually want to go against your narrative, which means you're oftentimes unable to go against this. Let's say there are a plurality of narratives, which means I don't know which narrative is actually going to be able to dominate and able to actually persuade. I don't know if there is a narrative that actually is going there. They need to prove that this is likely. I also want to note that this specifically actually trades to the short term. That's to say, I know how people are affected right now because that's what the effect I can measure. I don't know if this narrative still happens in 5 years, and I don't know if this narrative actually gets entrenched to an extent that they, for example, likely to commit like violence because they deeply believe in something and they now become religiously zealous. That is to say that everybody says like you get tested as a tool, but never actually explain why you're able to get the large impacts that you say. Therefore, we as CEO are going to take this debate out of debate land and into the real world. The extension is quite simple. 1, trolls can use this to do more harm. 2, people who have good incentives are now going to listen to other people more. So what is the extension? I think there are a lot of people who are actually able to use this poorly. I think 1, notice a lot of people can be very emotional about a lot of things, right? They can be angry because they saw a specific post, or the fact that they feel like they're not listened to by the government, or they generally have a very strong link to something specific. For example, there are many people who have very strong beliefs about what's happening is right now with Hamas and Israel and Palestine. At the moment, you're going to give them now this power. The moment they make an emotional post about this, most likely they're going to do something which is going to be more harmful. That's to say, I feel like no one is listening to me. I feel really angry. I'm going to rebel against the system. I actually going to get some happiness by seeing some Israelis being angry because they have seen my post. Therefore, they're much more likely to use this to actually get that anger, get that backlash. But I also want to know that at the moment this has happened, someone else who has been harmed, as an Israeli sees this and then also gets angry and then says, actually, I'm going to go against you. I'm actually going to use this against you. And therefore, you're going to have this cycle where you're going to continue these harmful things. Secondly, I want to note there are just a lot of people who are just edgy, right? Give this to a 15-year-old who has watched too much anti-feminist stuff on YouTube, and they're gonna be like, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm just gonna basically piss off some feminists because I think they're dumb, and I don't think the wage gap actually exists. Therefore, they're going to post stuff which is most likely going to be very harmful, and most likely is going to be like, we want to piss them off. Why is this actually then more likely to happen on our side of the house? One, note that they should become better at it. That's to say, trolls just want to make sure that people get outraged. And the moment you give them a better tool which knows which message outrages more people, they can just become significantly better at this. Secondly, I also want to note that oftentimes you're able to... Actually, I'll take a PY from OG while I read my notes.
Yeah, who cares more about precision, random trolls having fun on the internet, or the government doing public health and education messaging?
So again, I think you can say, oh, the US healthcare is going to be so good because they have anti-vapes. And now the vape company says, oh no, we're going to make good ads to make you vape more. I don't know who's likely to happen. No one actually really explains why this is unique for Delta, or why actually you're going to be able to use ads to such an extent that you're able to impact the whole health, because there's a myriad of reasons, such as capitalism, or the fact that companies just want to put a lot of sugar in stuff. Again, you really don't actually explain any large impact. So what is then the second mech for this? I think that in the status quo, there are oftentimes a great capacity to not react. That's to say, a lot of people have learned that at the moment somebody trolls you, you just shouldn't react, because then they don't get the enjoyment out of it. But now, literally, you can just see the numbers go up. You can see that the person has become angry. But also, this gamifies it. You're like, the previous post that I had only like made 100 people just a bit angry. Now I'm going to try to reach 120 people. I'm going to make people worse. I think at that point, you're much more likely to actually use this. Why is this impactful? I want to note this is a huge skill upgrade, because there's a larger capacity for you to actually harm these individuals. But I also want to note, right? Oftentimes this is angering, and this is like circular, therefore also increasing the amount of people who get harmed. But also, I think just being angry is really annoying, right? It harms the people around you, because at the moment you are angry, you're less likely to actually be fun to be around. You're much more likely to do things that you also regret, because you are in an emotional state, and therefore you feel like you've done bad things. And at that point, we think this is just a huge impact that we have. Why does this then not work for trying to convince people? I think on the alternative, when you try to convince people, are much more likely to actually think about the message you're going to send out, which is you're actually going to think about, what do I specifically want to say, and what do I specifically believe? Whereas you're going to use this machine to check, how can I persuade the most people? Therefore, you're actually not going to think about your message. But secondly, to think about your efficacy, to create more efficacy, you're going to think, what would other groups actually find good? That is to say, what do other groups actually like, and what are they going to be actually convinced by? That's to say, you're going to listen more to what these people are thinking, which creates a better level of understanding. I think this is also great, because you get actually better discussion, right? Because you get a better understanding of people. Just because you have maybe convinced more people of one specific belief doesn't mean that you actually know what it is like, and you're much more likely to still be angry against them if they still speak out against you. But having a better conception of why they have the specific views they have, means you oftentimes have more constructive, but also you see them as more legitimate, which means you're less likely to actually hate them. To this extent, you're able to actually solve this form of polarization. But I also want to note, right? The same thing happens with gamification, right? If you are a social movement, now you're going to virtue signal by saying, oh, look, I was able to convince, 50 people to become feminist. And you're like, oh, actually, I did 70. Which means, again, you're going to do this in a way where you're going to not think about what other people actually are thinking and why they should be changing their opinions, but rather that you're going to be able to get a large number. I think that this is important because there's no a priori reason why any social movement would be good. That's to say, abortion movements can use this, but also anti-abortion movements can use this. But I also don't know why any specific, average informed newspaper reader would have a specific preference for one group over the other. Now, why do I want to weigh? I want to note that there's an inherent preference that we have for actually mitigating harm, which we do on our side. One, intuitively, I think it is better for me to not steal from Elishma than to give Lucy $20. We say that actively it is more likely to be intuitive. That is worse. Maybe not for you, Lucy, but for most people it is. But I also think, secondly, I want to know that people oftentimes have preferences, right? But they are oftentimes based on what they already know. That's to say, Ayal is not going to be angry for not receiving a bike if he never accepted it. But at the moment you expected to go to Facebook and just, not be pissed off, or, you were just having a good mood, and now that has changed and your context has changed, that is a specific harm that is going to be more palatable. And I think that to that extent, we already showed that this revealed preference means we should mitigate harm. That means that even if the best case scenario where CG Whips says maybe some reason you can be used good, the fact that we actually mitigate harm is something that we care about by this weighing metric. To that extent, we're basically winning debate by getting it out of debate land, actually improving our impacts, saying that people get pissed off and pissed off people are just not as happy. We therefore simply win the debate from closing opposition. Vote CO.
I would like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and I welcome the proposition whip. Hear, hear.
So I want to do the same thing that Sharia did and thank him for, being a great partner, going with me all the way to here. We crawled through Dion, we crawled through Huaji and Slamova, we crawled through Tejas. Here we are, and we're planning to win this. And let's just fucking go with this. Starting now. The reason why CG takes this debate is because we are the only team in this debate that actually has the impact where it means the most. Opening opposition and opening government both fall into the same trap. They are incredibly white. What I mean by that is that they live in a world in which the only harm that you can plausibly access is whether or not there's going to be slightly more polarization, slightly more economic policy, slightly more health policy, whether or not US is going to get marginally more vaccines. This is not a debate about the US, because the US is going to have a pluralistic environmental information environment. What this means is that for every single newspaper article from Washington Post, there comes a New York Times article. Those two outlets have a competitive incentive to outweigh each other and to present similarly persuasive things at the point where they both have access to this technology. Because again, the most charitable way that we can accept the OO framing is that, look, this is expensive, but big businesses can still afford it. This is explicitly a concession that they give. I think that this is fair because they do smart analysis about how quantum computing, how this is really expensive and accessible to average people. But it is accessible to big news outlets. So at the point where there is multiple news outlets, they compete with each other and they can present you with competing evidence as for why your economic competitor is bad, why this company is bad, why this company is good, why this company is bad. This essentially just muddles down because people have persuasive arguments that affect them deeply from all sides of the debate, which means that eventually their effect on this becomes significantly vaccinated against this because they get persuasive arguments from different sides. They do not build echo chambers. They have persuasive from this side, from that side. So in fact, it even becomes a benefit for us. And the main reason why is because you get, apologies. Okay, back to the debate. What you create in this situation is that you have an environment that is saturated with news and you accept some of it, you reject some of it, but you have the power to do that because you have access to all of those, which means that to some degree, opening government gets some of their benefit. To some degree, opening opposition gets some of their harm. But realistically speaking, both of those cases mitigate each other to a significant degree because of the pluralistic environment information environment. And this implies that this debate should be weighed where it is most important, where there is just one source of information and where this source of information has so much power that they can decide what you believe. Because this is where opening opposition actually accrues, because people have so much coercive power over you as they claim. In reality, this doesn't happen in pluralistic economies and in pluralistic environments. Dictators. What does it mean to be a dictator? It means that you are tied inherently with your country. You die or live by this country state, which means that your biggest incentive is not to get hung out by your feet and left to dry because you want to make sure that people don't hate you enough, which means that your main incentive is to create policy that makes people not hate you, or to repress them enough to not make you hate them. But at the point where you do not really know how to make them not hate you, you are willing to go into killing them because repression is better for you than good policy if you can't actually achieve policy that is going to be acceptable to the people. Because again, your most fundamental incentive is that you don't want to get hung out and killed, which then means that you have all the incentives of legacy. You have all the incentives of being personally invested in this country. You actually probably like this country quite a bit because you did all of that work to become its ruler. Like at the point where you have the grit, the determination to actually become a ruler of a country, you probably could be like a really rich celebrity that has just like a good life, or just fuck off from the dictator, give it to someone else and just leave. Just live a good life with the wealth that you defrauded. But realistically speaking, people don't do that because they grow to care about the people that they govern. At the point where they can push the policy that those people are actually going to like and that those people and sell it with narratives that those people are actually going to accept, this is the way that you can actually create a healthy, stable economy where people's most important interests are actually represented. What this crucially then means is that people can live in a world, can live in a country that represents their preferences accurately in the long term and that creates policy that helps them in the long term. Because the dictator wants to make sure that the country remains stable over time, that people remain committed to, that people get the economic benefits that they continue to get, because their fate, again, is intransitory. It's tied to the economy itself, it's tied to the country itself, it's tied to their legacy, and it's tied to their pride incentives. Because again, at the point where you become this dictator, you really believe that you carry the fate of the nation on your shoulders, and you want to do it well, which means that you aren't likely to push incredibly bad policy. You are likely to push good policy, but you don't know how to sell it. This is why Rwanda descends into chaos and descends into a genocide eventually, because they can't sell the policy that they have. Because despite the fact that the policy maybe is good, good long-termistically, the short term is so terrible that people hate it, that people despise it, that people rebel. And this is when our impact happen. Because our main impact is whether or not rebels spring up. Because whether or not you convinced enough people, whether or not you squash dissent enough that people don't seek alternative locus of control. When they believe the propaganda, which is the concession coming in from both benches, then this is good. Because they actually believe that you are doing the right thing. They believe the narrative of nationalism that you have pushed. They actually are happy because they believe that what is happening is good for their long-term benefit, because you learn how to play them. This is a good thing, because maybe some of their agency is decreased, but their agency wasn't that great in the first place. The main reason why it wasn't great in the first place is because they lived in a country that has to be governed by a dictatorship. How do dictatorships arise? From multinational, multi-ethnic countries that have been drawn up after post-colonialism, that have no way of stabilizing themselves through a democratic means, because the incredible amount and plurality of locus of controls, locus of information, means that people get access to news that says, hey, look, those people are terrible, those people are murderers. But at the point where we actually have convincing information, people don't want to opt into it, don't seek that locus of control that is heavily penalized, that, you know, you get killed for looking for alternative locus of information. So if you don't want to do this because you're convinced by the government propaganda, you would prefer, I would like to take all.
Within conflict, hate is so extreme and psychological entrenchment is so strong that it's likely that this barometer finds that the way to propagandize your population is by joining in the conflict and hating on the enemy. Regardless, we prove that poverty creates the depravity for resources that causes conflict in the first place.
You prevent the conflict. Like, the thing is that when you come into the government, you aren't automatically hit with like 1 million rebels that want to kill you immediately. This dissent and this resentment builds up over time. This is Sharia's explicit preemption to this. Realistically speaking, you are going to try to make this policy long term, and you are going to try to make people happy with this. I also want to weigh that actually people will be good off by living in this policy. Why? Because people's most fundamental interests are represented when their long-term welfare is covered. When the long-term welfare isn't going to be able to be covered by them because, one, they do not have access to all the information that the government has. They do not know how to make themselves happy. Two, they do not know how to make themselves economically stable, because maybe they spend on something that they understand to be good in the short term, but it's not actually in the long term. Only the government can be able to have all the information, all the experts to advise this policy. Three, and most importantly, people are really short-termist and biologically necessitated to make bad decisions for themselves, because they cannot differentiate between having food now and having food tomorrow, because their brain is wired for short-term survival because of the way that we have evolved as jungle animals that have been struggling every single day for whether or not they survive. So proud to propose, so proud to hopefully win my first ever final of an international.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and I welcome the opposition whip. Hear, hear.
Am I audible and visible?
You are both, yes.
Fantastic. I'll take POIs in chat. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The biggest flaw of government bench is assuming that this technology is omnipresent, that it activates functionally like a god, that you can understand that every nuance of individual reactions, the way they backlash, the way they become upset, the way they become more buy-in. But this is not what the debate is. It's rather that you receive a measure of the amount of reaction that people have. Maybe you understand whether it's good or bad, but you're not exposed to those nuances or exposed to the decision-making calculus of every single individual within that group. We think having this generalization makes dialogue a lot more pernicious and allows for the worst abuses against individuals to accrue, such that the way they engage in dialogue is far more harmed. I'm going to prove to you why Piotr's extension was this debate, then I'm going to go in reverse chronological order and prove why we beat the other teams. Piotr's case is simple, that trolls can use this in a terrible fashion, knowing that people can be emotional on things, so you're able to stoke a lot of and cultivate a lot of harms against individuals when you're able to put forward bad messaging because you know it's going to get emotional response. Note that this text makes it easier for you to understand the scale of the reaction, not what the nuances are, because this tech isn't omnipotent. And therefore, these trolls have an incentive to create these high emotion reactions to galvanize a lot of anger and pain and suffering from a lot of people, because again, shits and giggles, again, they're terrible people, and again, they don't have those moral check marks that a lot of these actors have. This means that you viscerally cultivate a large amount of anger within people because you know exactly what to say in order to get this angry reaction, which means you're able to do it in a more intense and frequent manner. But note that this also flips the government claim, or particularly the OG claim about social movements or about groups using this for efficacy. Because if social movements do this, maybe you put forward the most triggering and painful things, you put forward this context because you know it's going to elicit the most highest and sympathetic response, but you don't know that this response that you get, even if it's really sympathetic, causes a lot of pain to people when they see suffering or they have to deal with this messaging. The issue then is you're insurrecting a lot of visceral reactions for people in order to get this efficacy in the first place and do it in a negative way. But the Prodar is the only team who the only person who tells you why the counterfactual is better. When you have to convince people on the alternative and understand their belief systems, how you want to convince them and where you want them to convince them to. You consider the perspective of other actors and what they can be convinced by, rather than trying to elicit the most emotional or large-scale response to them as possible and understand their nuances. The comparative is you just follow what the machine stokes to you about the highest amount of response rather than engaging with people. So you lose out on the nuances of discourse. I actually think these nuances are really important, because it's one thing to say that women are oppressed and that's bad, but it's another thing to engage with analysis that women are oppressed due to structural barriers that exist in things like healthcare and whatnot, because this is the things that you're unable to appeal to when you stoke the broad notions that exist and stoke a lot of broad anger. What does all this mean, and why is this debate winning? It means that first, government bench needed to prove why it's right to insurrect this mass emotional harm to people in order to get more efficacy in their messaging. I don't think they prove this trade-off. I also don't think they prove efficacy either. I'll deal with that more in rebuttal. But second, you're more able to convince people in the comparative when you're more likely to engage with the nuances that individuals have, rather than just looking at the blanket conception to the scale of what they react and whether this reaction is positive or negative, and not meaningfully able to insurrect those nuances in the first place. I'll deal firstly with closing government, then opening government, and weigh against our opening opposition. There's two claims from closing government: that the current research is bad. A couple of ways I want to contest this. I think you understand what impacts someone in that moment and in the short term, but you don't understand the way people are impacted in the long term. So if this is true, that means you get more homogenized messaging. I think messaging is only effective in the status quo because it's diverse. So for example, white men buy into feminism for different reasons. But if you believe one message is more effective and then the other in totality or majority of people, you preach that message and you don't have the variety messaging level of messagings that you need in order to actively change the minds of people. Unless you test against every single person, I don't think you get the wide variety of messaging that is needed to change people's minds. So even if the status quo is imperfect on its on its executions, the fact that you have a diversity of messages because no one necessarily knows which one's going to succeed or necessarily knows which one is the most effective, because they have different ways to approach things and different ways to analyze people's reactions, means that you have ability of messaging to be far more convincing, because you can deploy one response over the other. The bigger case against from closing government is the case about war, conflict, genocide, and whatnot. A couple of responses. Firstly, as a corrupt government or a dictator, you have so much ability and information to get power. You can set up fake oppositions to control and monitor dissent. When you have a mass amount of control and surveillance, you can you can see where dissent comes from. I also think you could just strongman armies or punish dissent in a way in which it is a lot easier than applying the whole root of this technology in the first place. Second, I don't know why you're going to use this machine to get policy feedback than to see how your dissidents react to their message. Because if it's easier to kill off 3 dissidents and by seeing how they react to their message, I don't know why you would not do that rather than change the way you engage with your messaging on a wide level in the first place, especially because you have a big amount of dissent in the first place. But third, you as a dictator believe in your power, you believe that you're right, and you believe that you're the savior within the state. I don't know why you are likely to change yourself. Fourthly, I think people should have the right to self-actualize. So if people have dissent, they ought to hang on to their dissent. I think OO weighs this pretty well. I don't think it's more important. I think the final push on things like preventing the Rwanda genocide because people misunderstood the policy is just frankly egregious, is because they had a bad policy and they want to insurrect that. I think it becomes far much more easier to do that on the alternative. I'll take closing government.
So to be clear, Opbench concedes that this technology lets you convince people of the things you believe in. That's how all of their harms occur. But we explain the people who desperately need to convince people are the ones who are forming states that don't fall apart. This might not be a likely constant impact, but it's a huge one, and it happens to the 70 countries in the world.
Two things. Firstly, I don't think so. States fall apart for a plurality of reasons, such as resource constraints, such as conflict. I don't think this becomes a tipping point. But second, I think what Piotr gives you better mechanisms as to how you're going to convince people against opening government. I think firstly, on better understanding for discussions, I think the comparative is that you actually don't see the way, the nuanced fashion in which people engage with the discussions in the first place. So I don't think you're able to elicit better responses. I think that I dealt with this in my push of the strategic positioning. But second, I think if you're in a relationship and you have a person in love and you want to test out the other person in love, I don't think this is necessarily a good thing, because first, I think it's better if you force yourself to evaluate your relationship. Second, I think it's good to look forward to waiting for your partner to say, I love you back. But third, your partner probably hates you and hates this if you have substantive control over people. I think the issue is, I don't know if the information that opening government says becomes more believable just because the perception of this information becomes incorrect, because people are convinced by different things. People have unique nuances that you need to engage with. And I don't think you're going to deploy this policy against like every single person in the first place. I think if the government wants to do this health messaging in a positive way, they probably still have the ability and the power to do so in the first place. Against opening opposition, look, we're just under so much surveillance. I worked in the search engine optimization. You can literally see how long someone stays on a website, what they click, where these demographics are. So I don't think the scale of this impact is the degree of surveillance that you get. I think the scale is then what Piotr tells you about the amount of individuals who would suffer more on the comparative, which also beats their principal argumentation because of the visceral harm that we prove. Proud to win from closing opposition.
I would like to thank the speaker for that fine speech. Thank you all for the debate. Do you want to stop the recording?